Family loyalty means nothing when millions are on the line. Stripped of his rightful inheritance by a rigged will, he used his last few dollars to buy a rotting, forgotten farm. He thought his life was ruined. He didn't know he was standing on a secret that would utterly destroy his brother's stolen empire. The mahogany-paneled office of Gregory Finch, attorney at law, smelled of lemon polish and impending doom. David Harrington sat rigidly in a wingback chair, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. Beside him sat his wife, Sarah, her comforting hand resting on his knee. Across the expansive desk sat David's older brother, Richard. Richard was wearing a bespoke Italian suit that cost more than David's car, casually checking his Rolex, as if this reading of their father's last will and testament was keeping him from a more important lunch reservation. Their father, Charles Harrington, had built Harrington Logistics from a single rusted delivery truck into a $40 million empire spanning the eastern seaboard. For 15 years, David had worked in the grueling heat of the distribution warehouses, managing logistics, repairing fleets, and bleeding for the family name. Richard, meanwhile, had stayed in the air-conditioned corporate headquarters, schmoozing clients and playing golf. David had always assumed the business would be split evenly. That was the promise. That was what his father had whispered to him just weeks before the sudden, fatal heart attack. Gregory Finch cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. To my eldest son, Richard Harrington, Finch read, his voice devoid of emotion, I leave the entirety of my controlling shares in Harrington Logistics, the estate in Connecticut, and all associated liquid assets. The words dropped into the room like lead weights. David stopped breathing. Sarah's hand tightened painfully on his leg. To my youngest son, David, Finch continued, not looking up from the parchment, I leave a one-time cash disbursement of $45,000. It is my hope he uses this to find his own path. What? David gasped, standing up so fast his chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. That's impossible. Dad and I talked a month ago. We were expanding the Baltimore hub. He said we were partners. Richard finally looked up from his watch, offering a thin, reptilian smile. Dad's mind was failing, David. We all knew it. The board knew it. He realized you didn't have the stomach for corporate leadership. You're a warehouse manager, a grease monkey. He secured the company's future. You poisoned him against me, David said, stepping toward his brother. You manipulated him when he was weak. I protected the legacy, Richard countered smoothly, standing up and buttoning his jacket. Take your 45 grand, David. Pay off your little credit card debts. Don't call me again. If you try to contest this, I will bury you in legal fees until you're bankrupt. David was utterly broken. The $45,000 was an insult, a rounding error in his father's accounts. After paying taxes and the remaining medical bills they had fronted for Charles's care, David and Sarah were left with exactly $42,000. They were living in a cramped Boston apartment that they could barely afford on David's suddenly terminated salary, because of course, Richard's first act as sole CEO was to fire his brother. Weeks turned into a nightmare of unanswered job applications and dwindling savings. The city was bleeding them dry. Desperation sets in like a cold rot. They needed a place to live, a place where the bank couldn't evict them, a place owned outright. Late one night, bathed in the blue glow of a laptop screen, David found it on a county tax default auction site. It was the old Abernathy farm in the Ole Valley of rural Pennsylvania. 40 acres of heavily overgrown land and a farmhouse built in 1912. The starting bid was exactly $40,000. No one else wanted it. The pictures showed a sagging porch, a roof missing half its shingles, and a barn that looked ready to collapse into a pile of splintered lumber. David, it's a ruin, Sarah whispered, looking over his shoulder. Tears brimmed in her eyes. We don't know anything about farming. We don't know anyone in Pennsylvania. It's land, Sarah, David replied, his voice hoarse. It's 40 acres that Richard can't touch. It's a roof. If we stay here, we're on the street in 3 months. I can fix it. I know how to build. I know how to work. 2 days later, David wired the funds. He had spent his entire inheritance on a rotting, forgotten patch of dirt. He had lost a $40 million empire, and in its place, he had gained a money pit. The real estate photos had been generous. When David and Sarah pulled their battered Ford pickup onto the dirt driveway of the Abernathy property, the reality of their situation hit them with the force of a physical blow. Nature was actively reclaiming the farm. Thorny brambles choked the front porch, curling around the rotting wooden pillars like green pythons. The smell of mildew and animal decay wafted from the broken front windows. Inside, the floorboards were spongy, the wallpaper was peeling off in long, jaundiced strips, and the plumbing was a rusted fantasy. "We can do this," David said, though his voice cracked. He squeezed Sarah's hand. She didn't squeeze back. She just stared at the ruined kitchen, silent tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. The first month was a masterclass in suffering. David worked from dawn until midnight. He patched the roof with cheap tin and tar, inhaling toxic fumes in the sweltering summer heat. He tore out rotting floorboards, his hands covered in blood, blisters that popped and calloused over. Sarah took a job as a waitress at a diner, 2 towns over, coming home smelling of stale coffee and grease, handing over her meager tips to buy nails, bleach, and canned beans. The farm seemed to actively fight them. If David fixed a pipe, a wire would short out. If he cleared a field of brush, a hidden trench would break the axle of the second-hand lawn tractor he'd bought. Their nearest neighbor was a mile down the road, an elderly, cynical man named Elias Cobb. Elias drove by one afternoon in a rusted Chevy, rolling down his window to spit tobacco juice onto the gravel. "You the fool who bought the Abernathy place?" Elias rasped, eyeing David's sweat-soaked shirt. "I am," David said, leaning on his shovel. "David Harrington." Elias chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Should have done your homework, city boy. That land is sour. The Abernathys went broke on it back in the 50s. Old man Arthur Abernathy went crazy, swearing the soil was cursed. Packed up his family in the dead of night in 54 and vanished. Place has been sitting in probate, rotting ever since. You're throwing good money into a grave." Elias drove off, leaving David standing in the dust. The financial strain began to tear at the seams of David and Sarah's marriage. Arguments flared up over every spent dollar. David was exhausted, angry at his brother, and consumed by the desperate need to prove Richard wrong. He stopped sleeping. He became obsessed with saving the farm, even as it was destroying him. Then, in mid-October, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. A massive nor'easter stalled over the Ole Valley, dumping unrelenting, torrential rain for 3 straight days. The wind howled, ripping away David's patchwork tin roof. Water poured into their makeshift bedroom, soaking their mattress and ruining the few clothes they hadn't packed away in plastic bins. On the 3rd night of the storm, standing in the dark kitchen with a flashlight, listening to the rain destroy months of his hard work, David finally broke. He threw a hammer through a remaining pane of glass, screaming into the storm, cursing his father, cursing Richard, and cursing the day he was born. Sarah packed a small bag. She told him she was going to stay at a cheap motel near the diner. She couldn't take the cold, the wet, and the anger anymore. When morning finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, biting wind. David stood alone on the porch, holding a mug of instant coffee, looking out at his ruined kingdom. He had lost his father, his inheritance, his brother, and now he was losing his wife. He walked out toward the collapsed remains of the massive red barn, intending to see if his tools had survived the flood. The ground was saturated, turning the property into a thick, sucking mud pit. As he approached the rear of the barn, he stopped. The torrential rainwater had pooled and washed away a massive section of earth near the stone foundation. A sinkhole had opened up nearly 10 feet across and plunging deep into the ground. It looked like the earth had simply swallowed itself. David crept to the edge of the muddy precipice, peering down into the darkness. He expected to see a broken water main or an old, collapsed septic tank. Instead, he saw brickwork. About 8 feet down, the mud had washed away to reveal a perfectly laid archway of red bricks, completely unnatural and heavily reinforced. Embedded in the center of the brickwork was a thick, oxidized iron door, secured by a heavy rotary latch that looked like it belonged on a bank vault, not a farm. It was entirely buried beneath tons of earth, hidden from the world for decades. David's heart began to hammer against his ribs. He ran back to the house, grabbed his shovel and a heavy iron crowbar. The cold and the exhaustion vanished, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. He didn't know what was buried under his ruined farm, but as he slid down the muddy banks of the sinkhole and struck the iron door with his crowbar, he knew his life was about to change all over again. David struck the heavy iron door with his crowbar. The sound was a dull, metallic thud that was immediately swallowed by the surrounding walls of mud. He struck it again, aiming for the massive rotary latch. Sparks flew in the dim grey morning light. His breath came in ragged gasps, his muscles burning from the cold and the exertion. He didn't care. For the first time in months, he felt something other than despair. He felt purpose. On the fourth strike, the rusted internal mechanism gave way, with a sickening crunch. David dropped the crowbar, wedged his bleeding fingers into the gap between the heavy door and its frame, and pulled with every ounce of strength he possessed. The hinges shrieked a sound like a dying animal, and the door swung outward, exhaling a gust of stale, remarkably dry air that smelled of ancient dust, machine oil, and old paper. David clicked on his heavy-duty, heavy Maglite flashlight and pointed the beam into the dark. Beyond the door was a perfectly preserved subterranean room, roughly 20 feet by 20 feet, lined with poured concrete. It wasn't a septic tank. It wasn't a root cellar. It was a vault. Heart pounding in his ears, David slid down the muddy embankment and stepped through the threshold. The floor was solid concrete, swept clean of debris. The temperature dropped instantly, the thick walls insulating the room from the autumn chill above. He panned the flashlight around. Stacked meticulously against the far wall were 8 olive-green wooden crates, bound in rusted iron straps. Next to them sat a large, heavy steel footlocker, the kind used by the military during the Second World War, secured by a heavy brass padlock. David's hand shook as he approached the first wooden crate. He used the edge of his flashlight to pry up the rusted iron bands, the brittle wood splintering easily. He lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth and wax paper, were small, heavy canvas bags. David pulled one out. It weighed a solid 10 pounds. He untied the rotting drawstring and poured the contents into his palm. A cascade of heavy, pristine silver discs tumbled into the beam of his flashlight. David gasped. They were Morgan silver dollars, completely uncirculated, their mint lusters shining as if they had been stamped yesterday. The dates on the coins read 1,889, 1,893, and 1,904. Even with his limited knowledge, David knew that uncirculated silver dollars from those years were highly coveted by numismatists. There had to be thousands of them in this crate alone. He moved frantically to the next crate, tearing it open. More bags. He opened a third. This one was entirely different. It was packed with tightly banded stacks of currency. But it wasn't modern money. They were Series 1,934 gold certificates and oversized, beautifully engraved $500 and $1,000 bills, perfectly preserved in the dry, airtight environment. David fell to his knees on the concrete floor, surrounded by a fortune that defied logic. Elias Cobb's words echoed in his mind. Arthur Abernathy packed up his family in the dead of night in '54 and vanished. Arthur hadn't just vanished. He had buried his entire liquid fortune, intending to come back, but he never did. Still reeling, David turned his attention to the heavy steel footlocker. He retrieved his crowbar from the mud outside and brought it down violently on the brass padlock. The old metal shattered. David threw back the heavy lid. There was no money in the footlocker. Instead, there were meticulously organized ledgers, bound in cracked leather, and a heavy, oiled leather satchel. David pulled the satchel out and unbuckled the straps. Inside was a thick, handwritten journal and a sealed manila envelope marked with a notary stamp dated the 12th of November, 1952. David opened the journal. The handwriting was sharp, jagged, and precise. It was Arthur Abernathy's diary. David sat on one of the crates of silver, shining his light on the yellowed pages. As he read, the blood drained from his face. the true story of the Ole Valley farm and his own family began to unravel. Arthur Abernathy hadn't been just a farmer. In the late 1940s, he had started a lucrative, albeit shadowy, freight operation, moving untaxed goods, bootleg liquor, and high-value black market items across state lines. To run the logistics of his fleet, Arthur had hired a hungry, ruthless young mechanic from Boston. That mechanic's name was Charles Harrington. David's breath hitched. His father, according to the diary, Charles and Arthur had formally incorporated their business in 1952, but Charles was greedy. By 1954, Charles had quietly tipped off federal agents to Arthur's illegal shipments, while simultaneously siphoning off the company's legitimate cash flow. When the net began to close, Charles gave Arthur an ultimatum: flee the state, or go to federal prison for the rest of his life. Arthur fled, abandoning the farm. But he didn't leave empty-handed. He liquidated every asset he had into untraceable silver, high-denomination bills, and gold certificates, burying them in his custom-built vault. But it was the manila envelope that made David's heart stop. He tore it open. Inside were heavy, ornately bordered certificates. They were original bearer shares for Abernathy and Harrington Transit Holding Co., the parent corporation that owned all the trucks, the warehouses, and the operating licenses. Unlike modern registered stocks, bearer shares are completely anonymous. Whoever physically holds the paper certificates is the legal owner of the equity. The certificates in David's hands represented exactly 51% of the controlling interest in the company. When Arthur fled, Charles assumed the shares were lost or destroyed. Charles simply changed the name of the operating company to Harrington Logistics and built his empire, completely ignoring the fact that the parent holding company still legally owned everything. David stared at the paper. The $40 million empire that Richard had stolen from him didn't belong to Richard. It didn't even belong to their father. Half of it had been built on stolen property. And because David had purchased the Abernathy estate in a county tax deed sale, a legal process that transferred ownership of the land and all abandoned property, fixtures, and chattels upon it to the buyer, the bearer shares now legally belonged to him. He didn't just have a small fortune in silver and old currency. He held the guillotine blade that could sever Richard's head from his stolen empire. 2 days later, David walked into a high-end numismatic and rare currency dealer in downtown Philadelphia. He looked like a homeless man, still wearing his mud-stained boots and a worn canvas jacket. But in his heavy duffel bag, he carried 30 of the uncirculated 1,893 Morgan silver dollars and 5 of the $1,000 bills. The dealer, a skeptical man named Thomas, almost threw David out until he saw the coins. Thomas's jaw dropped. The coins were independently graded and verified over the next 4 hours. By the end of the day, David walked out of the shop with a cashier's check for $285,000, just a fraction of what was left back in the vault. His first stop was the cheap motel where Sarah was staying. When she opened the door, her eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted. David didn't say a word. He just pulled her into a tight embrace, burying his face in her shoulder. Then he led her to the small motel table and laid down the cashier's check, Arthur Abernathy's diary, and the bearer shares. "I told you I was going to fix it," David whispered, tears finally breaking through his hardened exterior. Sarah read the diary. She looked at the check. The exhaustion vanished from her face, replaced by a fierce, blazing clarity. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady. "Now," David said, a dangerous smile spreading across his face, "we hire the biggest shark in the ocean." With his newfound capital, David retained the services of Jonathan Sterling, a senior partner at a premier corporate litigation firm in Manhattan. Sterling was a ruthless, brilliant attorney who despised Gregory Finch and the old boy network of Harrington Logistics. Sterling spent a week forensically analyzing the bearer shares, tracing the corporate lineage of Harrington Logistics, and reviewing the tax deed sale of the Abernathy farm. "It's ironclad, David," Sterling said, sitting in his glass-walled office overlooking Central Park. "Your father never formally dissolved the holding company because he couldn't do it without these physical shares. Harrington Logistics is a wholly owned subsidiary of Abernathy and Harrington Transit. As the lawful owner of these bearer shares, you control 51% of the board. Richard is essentially your employee, and he has absolutely no idea. When do we strike? David asked, his pulse quickening. Tomorrow, Sterling replied, sliding a financial prospectus across the desk. Richard is holding an emergency shareholder meeting at your father's old headquarters. He's finalizing a deal to sell Harrington Logistics to a global supply chain conglomerate for $85 million. He's planning to cash out and walk away with everything. Not anymore, David said. The following morning, the atmosphere in the executive boardroom of Harrington Logistics was electric. Richard Harrington, wearing a custom charcoal suit, stood at the head of the massive mahogany table. Gregory Finch sat to his right, organizing stacks of acquisition contracts. A dozen board members and executives murmured excitedly about the impending buyout. Gentlemen, Richard began, projecting a voice of utter confidence. Today marks the culmination of my father's legacy and the beginning of a new, highly profitable chapter for all of us. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open with a resounding crack. The room fell dead silent. David walked in. He wasn't wearing mud-stained work clothes anymore. He was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit paid for by Arthur Abernathy's buried silver. He looked sharp, commanding, and dangerous. Flanking him was Jonathan Sterling, carrying a slim leather briefcase. "David?" Richard said, his confident smile faltering into a look of absolute disgust. "What the hell are you doing here? Security is supposed to keep trespassers out. Get out of my building before I have you arrested." "It's not your building, Richard," David said, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. He walked slowly toward the head of the table. Gregory Finch stood up, his face reddening. "David, this is highly inappropriate and illegal. You have no standing here. Your father's will was explicit." "My father's will distributed his assets," David replied smoothly, stopping just feet from his brother. "The problem, Gregory, is that my father didn't actually own this company." Richard laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Have you lost your mind? Are you drunk?" David didn't look at Richard. He nodded to his attorney. Jonathan Sterling stepped forward, opened his briefcase, and placed a stack of heavy, ornately bordered papers onto the mahogany table. "On behalf of my client, Mr. David Harrington," Sterling announced, his voice ringing with legal authority, "I am presenting the original, authenticated bearer shares of Abernathy and Harrington Transit Holding Company, representing a 51% controlling interest in all subsidiary assets, including Harrington Logistics." Finch's eyes widened behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He scrambled forward, snatching up the top certificate. His hands began to shake uncontrollably as he read the 1952 incorporation dates and the legal boilerplate. "What is that?" Richard demanded, his voice pitching up in panic. "Finch, what is he talking about?" They're bearer shares, Richard," Finch stammered, the color completely draining from his face. "The parent company. Your father told me these were destroyed in a fire in 1954. "He lied," David said coldly. "He forced his partner out and stole the infrastructure. But Arthur Abernathy buried the controlling shares beneath his farm, the exact same farm I bought in a county tax sale 3 months ago. The law is very clear, Richard. Abandoned property attached to a tax deed transfers to the purchaser. I own the shares." David leaned over the table, bringing his face inches from his brother's. Richard was sweating profusely, his arrogant facade shattering into a million pieces. "Which means," David continued, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, "I own 51% of this company. I am the majority shareholder. I am the board. And this $85 million sale, I'm vetoing it." "You can't do this," Richard screamed, slamming his hands on the table. "I built the corporate side of this. I secured this buyout. You're a grease monkey." "And you are fired," David said quietly. The boardroom erupted into chaos, but David didn't stay to listen. He turned his back on his brother, walked out of the mahogany-paneled room, and stepped into the elevator with Sterling. The weight of the past year, the betrayal, the mud, the freezing rain, the despair lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the thrilling lightness of total victory. In the weeks that followed, the corporate massacre was absolute. Sterling systematically dismantled Richard's executive power, freezing his assets pending a forensic audit of his time as CEO. Without the buyout, and buried under mounting legal fees to defend against David's newly acquired corporate power, Richard was forced to declare personal bankruptcy. Gregory Finch was investigated by the State Bar Association for corporate malfeasance. David, however, had no interest in running a logistics empire from a glass tower. Once his legal ownership was cemented, he authorized a new buyout with a different conglomerate, one that guaranteed the pensions and jobs of the warehouse workers and drivers he had worked alongside for 15 years. When the deal closed, David walked away with $43 million. He didn't buy a mansion in Connecticut. He didn't buy sports cars. Instead, he and Sarah returned to the Ole Valley. They hired a premier architectural firm and a small army of contractors. Over the next year, they transformed the ruined Abernathy farm into a breathtaking estate. The heavily forested acres were cleared and manicured. The sagging farmhouse was rebuilt into a stunning, modern craftsman home, and the collapsed barn was replaced by a massive, state-of-the-art workshop where David spent his days restoring the classic cars he had always dreamed of owning. Deep beneath the foundation of the new workshop, the heavy iron door of the old vault remained securely locked. The vintage silver and gold certificates were still down there, resting in the cool, dry dark. David didn't need them anymore. He kept them there as a reminder, a monument to the strange, twisted hand of fate that had taken everything from him, only to give him back the world. The Abernathy secret didn't just save David, it delivered justice. What started as a desperate final act turned into the ultimate checkmate against corporate greed and betrayal. If you love this story of hidden treasures and sweet revenge, make sure to hit that like button, leave a comment below, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories.